So in this training, we have a a lot of techniques, a lot of invitations toward essence that we call sadhana. And these are little trick things that we can do, like inhabit your stance or inhabit your seat or uh, breathe with your full range of breath. And we have a number of these little, like mini practices that take up what we would call a bigger practice of a class or of a pose. And one of our goals as practitioners is to practice in such a way that it becomes more than the sum of the parts. And particularly, the reason for that being that the hope is with yoga that there's an unfoldment out of the body. Like you do a pose, you breathe in a certain way, and there's something that results out of that. There's an emergence that comes out of the body that hopefully accumulates, say, by the end of the class as a deeper connection to being, a sense of just simply being in the satisfaction of being. At the end of a pose, it is hopefully something that also adds to that. And we have a model for what that accumulating or having a cascade of emergence looks like. And we call it Spanda. You can think of Spanda in a way as an accumulation of polarity. If we can do something that creates more than the sum of the parts, that gives us a platform to get even more than the sum of the parts and so on. And when there becomes a cascade of them, it looks like this. It looks like a wave. It grows and grows before it dissipates or dispels. And so we build polarity on polarity, and then it dispels. And so we have Spanda. Now, Spanda in itself is a concept that comes out of Hatha Yoga, specifically Tantra, and it is applicable to many areas. So what I like to say is when we do something like model one of our teaching tools on Spanda, it's applied Spanda. We're applying it to something specific. So we're applying it to something specific like sequencing. That would be applied Spanda. Or we are applying it to something specific like how to cue a pose. That would be applied Spanda. And if we apply Spanda to really anything, it comes into 4 pieces. This is mainly for convenience. I find that this works very well for being able to categorize in the mind what otherwise is a type of feel. Spanda is something that we tend to experience in our practice. But it is helpful to have some conceptual ties to that experience in order to help design ways that we might recreate it. And that's really what we're trying to do with sequencing and with cueing and our teaching tools, which is recreate this experience of Spanda. As such, it is helpful to divide it into 4 areas. One that gets Spanda going, that gets it on track. 2, which is the climbing of more and more than the sum of the parts. 3 is the apex, and 4 is the dissolution or the release of that particular application of Spanda. So if this were a pose, then 1 might be getting into just the basic shape. 2 is just starting to be able to cultivate some life and some light and some thriving in the pose. 3 is the apex of that, and 4 would be we get out of the pose, because as we are taught, common sense, but also, this is a foundation of many of the Eastern traditions. Everything that emerges, everything that comes into existence, and Spanda as our model of emergence, disappears again. And so you can't do a pose forever. So we have to have that part 4, which is the dissolution or the release of it. So when we apply Spanda to a single exercise, oftentimes exercise in yoga is a pose, but it could be a movement like cow-cat. It could be a a breath exercise or something like that. But usually we're talking about a pose here when we apply Spanda to a single exercise. We have these same 4 parts, and the 4 parts are, one, that we are getting into the basic form or setting the basic movement in the case of something like cow-cat. That essentially puts us on our trajectory. Then we are building emergence. We are building those factors in the cow-cat that help something more than the sum of the parts happen. We have an apex of that, and then a dissolution. So what does that look like on closer inspection in a single pose? Well, upon closer inspection, and we have these 4 parts. The 4 parts are, 1, getting into the basic form or setting the basic movement. This is just getting into what we call the stick figure resolution of the shape of the pose. So if, say, the pose is Warrior 2, then we're just getting into or helping our students get into something that is close enough to what it would look like if you drew a stick figure of Warrior 2, right? So we're not getting picky about, is the hip an inch this way or that way? Are the arms exactly parallel? You wouldn't be able to tell that in a stick figure. So those things are other elements to the pose. So first we have the basic form, and once we're in the basic form, it's almost like a little mini container where we can now cultivate something greater, some kind of greater aliveness in the pose. And that's where we get into the second phase. This is where you see it climbing up the wave, and this is where what we call building emergence. And specifically, when it comes to practicing yoga poses, this is doing what I'm going to call adding shine. And shine is, this was a happy accident of an acronym that came about it as I was playing with this. But what that is right, you're adding this sense of life to the pose, this sense of light coming out in the pose. And so you're adding shine. And shine is also an acronym for the types of elements that we look for to build that emergence, which are S for sensitivity. Sensitivity, you'll recall, is the capacity to perceive greater and greater nuance without reactivity. It is the how elements of the pose. So for example, if the pose is Warrior 2, Warrior 2 is what you're doing. This is where we would get into how we would go about it. What muscles do we use? What muscles do we hug in? How do we breathe? Things like that. It is the integrity elements. And integrity, you'll remember, is defined as being able to maintain something more foundational despite external challenge. So something like being able to secure in the joints in the back. So we talk about keeping a C curve in the back instead of a V point in the back. And so maintaining integrity of the spine, and say a back bend would be making sure to maintain that C curve. It means adding nuance to the pose, adding little elements to the pose that are less obvious, say, than the stick figure form, or more, less obvious than the stick figure form, but can add up to more. Or just getting into essence, essence being that part of practice that's a little less definable. It's not pure technique, but rather are the types of things that are invitations to get into the more intuitive, to get into the more instinctual, to get into those less definable areas, like walk, don't wobble is one example from early in the training. So when we're in a pose, if we are bringing these elements of shine, particularly as we've talked about with various sadhanas, then you're building emergence. And then this This Spanda wave is going to peak at some point, and this is where we get to a culmination, a gestalt, or append some final shine. Now, 2 and 3 are different parts of this wave. Both of them involve bringing these shine elements to the pose, right? Bringing some kind of life that's not simply the shape to the pose. The difference here is step 3 is at the end of it. And so the intention of step 3 is that this is where we bring the culmination of those elements, or the gestalt, or just simply append. Culminate meaning that there's a big something that you're building to in the pose. And so you're adding things together in step 2, and then step 3 is the big thing that all those things build to. A gestalt is a similar idea. That may be the word on there that you're less familiar with, but a gestalt is simply when when something is made of many parts, but somehow those many parts make for something that is different than the combination of the parts. Most of the time in the meaning here, it's that they're more than the sum of the parts. And so if there's a way in which what you build in step 2 is more than the sum of the parts, step 3 is the place of expressing it. Or if you're cueing the pose, of being able to point it out, or to create that more than the sum. And to append is simply to add more to. So you don't have to have every pose end in this just grand explosion of something, right? Sometimes you're simply just building the elements up, and then the pose ends. And so it could also just simply be appending shine that you started out with in step 2. And then the final phase of the pose is going to be the dissolution, which is where one of 2 things will happen to dissolve the pose. One is a transition, which is to say, go to the next pose. And the other is an integration, which integration poses are things like meditative seat, standing samastiti, child's pose, shavasana. They're basically poses that are very easy to do, very native for the person's body, so that they can simply rest and sense and be. And you'll notice that a lot of times in our practices, we'll take these little moments from time to time to sense and be. And it's a way to help the nervous system integrate, because we can be performing all of these changes on the body through our poses and our other exercises we're doing through a yoga practice. But if we don't take time to let the nervous system integrate, to let it complete what we have started for it, then oftentimes those changes don't stick quite as much. And so it's helpful to have an integrative moment, although it would be a lot to do that for every pose. So sometimes it's just simply the transition to the next pose is what takes us out of a pose or dissolves the pose. So looking at this more specifically through a teaching lens, when it comes to cueing, we then have 4 parts to cue. And all of these correspond to the phases of the pose that I just talked about. So the first phase of cueing is what we call nuts and bolts. And nuts and bolts are simply your cues to make the basic shape of the pose, the stick figure resolution of the pose. You're just trying to get your student from one stick figure position to another stick figure position. That's what enables everything else in the pose to happen. And so that's the first phase that initiates this wave. The second part is to add shine. And so adding shine means, okay, we got the basic shape. Can we make that basic shape a living pose, a living human cultivating pose for the body? And so really just anything that brings life to the body, almost anything that you can think of for a pose that isn't cueing the basic shape is shine. Right? It's giving life to the pose and action to the pose. And so if you get stuck on this, if that's a little too general to cultivate, then just think of what are elements of sensitivity, how elements as opposed to what elements, elements of integrity or nuance or essence that I might add. But really, simply, this is just where you would cue things that aren't the basic shape. So you cue the basic shape, then you cue the things that aren't the basic shape or add life or shine to the pose. And then we get the apex, which is shine CAG, or the cueing shine to its culmination, its append, or its gestalt. And then we get to the transition or integration. And oftentimes what that fourth phase is actually phase number 1 of the next pose. You're just cueing the nuts and bolts of the next pose to transition, or you're cueing to get into an integration pose so that folks can allow what has happened in the last pose or the last few sets of poses to trickle and integrate into the body. So with that, let us look at an example. So here's an example of a cue that I might write out for triangle pose in these 4 phases here. So first we got the nuts and bolts. So in this case, I'm being quite verbose on the nuts and bolts. Since we actually end up in this training, when we first learn to cue, we tend to be a bit more verbose with the nuts and bolts. Not because I want you to be verbose when you actually teach, actually the minimum number of words to get them into the basic form, just like saying triangle. Whatever the most efficient way that they can do it cleanly, feel like they know what's going on the whole time, and is the minimum number of words, is exactly what you want to do for this first step in any pose. So ideally, I might just say step your right foot forward into triangle pose, something like that. Or I might use waypoints and go step your right foot forward into warrior 2 and come into triangle. However, we will spend time with nuts and bolts because it is common as a yoga teacher that there's going to be some critical moment in class where it's really going to throw things off if you can't spit out some verbose nuts and bolts for a pose that students aren't familiar with at the corner of the room, because that's where the beginners like to hide out. They think they're hiding out over there. So they'll be in the back corner, and they'll get very lost if you don't give out the verbose nuts and bolts for some of the poses. So there are moments that when you need nuts and bolts, you need them. And so we practice them a lot so that you can quickly just spit them out when you need them. That said, if you have a room full of experienced students, particularly the layout aids itself for students to be able to just visually pick up what's going on a lot of the time. Most of the time, I would say use a lot fewer words in your nuts and bolts than I have here. But what I have here is a thorough version, and we're going to practice thorough versions at least at the start of learning how to cue. So nuts and bolts, example here for triangle pose. Step your right foot forward between your hands. Rise up and straighten both legs as you point your right foot toward the X wall and your left foot towards the Y wall. Obviously, those are wall label names. Hinge from your hips over your right leg into triangle pose as you extend your right fingertips toward the floor and your left fingertips toward the sky, right? So I've got them in the stick figure form of the pose now. Now we add some shine. Take 3 breaths as you anchor your legs to the earth and drive your feet into the ground. We get to the accumulation of the shine. begin to grow out of your anchor as you turn your heart to the ceiling. And then we transition. On your next exhale, turn to the floor, framing your right foot and stepping back to plank pose. So notice there's nothing ultra fancy in any of these shine areas or the rest of it. So really just anything that you feel like adds life to the pose, anything that seems like a nice thing to add on that's not the basic form is likely going to fit into these. And especially that's where I would recommend you start when it comes to adding shine. And as you get going with this, I think what you'll find is oftentimes you can begin to bring in the elements such that they compound on or add on each other, but they don't need to. Anytime that you can help students have a deeper and richer experience of the pose, you are adding something that makes it more alive for them. You are adding shine. And that's really all that we need to do in phase 2 and 3 here. So with that, I have a shine assignment for you right after I do the assignment of moving my head again. The shine assignment is for each pose to create a cue. It could be very few words, it could be a lot of words, but create some cue, which is to say, again, we don't need to complicate this. A cue is just giving the student something to do. You're just communicating something to do to the student. So for each pose, create a cue, something for the student to do that fits each type of shine. And the purpose of this assignment is to help your brain stir up not just certain elements of shine, sometimes giving your brain a cue like, how could we get more sensitive in this pose, can help you think of shine elements that you wouldn't otherwise think of. Sometimes just giving your brain the overall general cue, like what are things that add life to the pose? That'll give you shine elements. But what I want to do here is cue your brain with a variety or an ecology of shine elements so that it can accomplish a couple things. One is perhaps it'll help you think of things that you wouldn't otherwise think of. But two, especially as we get practicing a lot of cues, a lot of times we may get stuck in a rut where we're constantly bringing literally the same shine elements in. And there are other times also where perhaps we are giving a variety of shine elements, but they all kind of are in the same neighborhood. And so what this is it's saying, here's 5 of the neighborhoods, and can you play with them so that you get the feeling of the whole town, right? So the town is made of 5 neighborhoods, and you get the feeling of the whole town. So the 5 neighborhoods of shine elements are what the acronym is: sensitivity, how, integrity, nuance, and essence. And what you'll notice about these neighborhoods or these categories is that there is quite a lot of overlap in some of them. And so I would say don't get too stuck in your head about what category it fits, because there's a pretty good chance that a lot of them might fit a couple categories, sometimes even 3 or 4 categories. That can happen in the same way that, there are probably places we could stand in Madison and say, what neighborhood are we in? Are we in the Atwood neighborhood or the Marquette neighborhood right here, right? There's probably places we could stand where we could probably make a case for being in 3 or 4 different neighborhoods at the same time. Same thing here. There are going to be things that intersect. But the assignment would be for a pose, and the example that I'm going to give you guys is triangle pose. So for something like triangle pose, for each pose that you have in your write-ups, to just think of a sensitivity element. So what is something you could say to a student to communicate or encourage them to get more sensitive to the pose, which is to say, to enable their power of being able to distinguish, their power to be able to experience. The other category is the how element. So not just what to do, right? So for a lot of beginners, what they're first learning in yoga is really all of the what stuff, which is to say they're learning, oh, this is warrior two pose and this is triangle pose. Now, after a while, what they really need after that is how. Okay, how can we refine this pose? How can we have an easier expression of this pose? How do we do the exercise? How do we do the pose? So how element. Really, all of these are how elements to some degree, but there are certain ones that don't fit in these other categories. Also to think of some kind of cue you could give that would encourage integrity in the pose. And so what is something they can maintain despite challenge? I gave the example earlier of keeping a C curve in the back when we backbend. Whenever we backbend, the temptation is a big word with integrity. So if you're not sure about integrity, think about what is the temptation that's easy to fall into in this pose, right? So one of the temptations that's really easy to fall into when you're doing, say, camel, is to just bend in that really flexible spot in your low back and make it a V instead of a C shape. What is the temptation that's easy to fall into, say if I'm holding a plank for a little while? The temptation sometimes is to hold my breath, right? So being able to continue to breathe in the pose is breath integrity, that I'm maintaining a foundational element of my practice despite the challenge that is being placed on me. That's an integrity element. I would also like you to brainstorm a nuance element, which is to say, is there something about the pose that isn't obvious to the student? As well as an essence element, some kind of invitation to the intuitive, to the instinctive, or to the inexact. You can steal any of the sadhanas that we've talked about here that fit into the essence side of the equation, things like inhabit your stance, inhabit your seat, things like walk, don't wobble, right? You could literally just take any of those, insert them into the pose. Or you could also, in this case, just add something that is relatable to something else they might do, right? Something that's intuitive to them. Like press your hand firmly into the ground like you're making an even handprint in the sand, right? There's a way in which a cue like that stirs a kind of richness to it, whereas just saying press your hand to the mat, sometimes it gets hung up in the logical circuitry and it doesn't embody itself in this rich way that doing something like giving a metaphor or some imagery does. And metaphors and imagery are oftentimes the way that we express our essence cues. And so with this assignment, I give the example of triangle pose. So all I'm doing here is I'm coming up with something about triangle pose that I could communicate that fits each of these categories. And so in the case of sensitivity, of getting that more, kind of like a wine connoisseur can taste a sip of wine and taste like 10 different things in it, right? They have a sensitivity to that, right? We're aiding them in becoming a yoga pose connoisseur, where they sip on a warrior two and they're like, there's like a little bit of woodiness in there and it's kind of sweet, tastes like it was grown on the north side of the hill, stuff like that. So that's really what we're doing when we give some kind of sensitivity cue. So a sensitivity cue that I might give for triangle pose is, notice if your right side, this is from our previous example, so it's triangle on the right side. So the cue would be, notice if your right side body has started to slump. Have you shortened it compared to your left side body, right? Because we know that the side we bend toward in triangle pose is where we tend to collapse, where your students are going to tend to try to reach the floor or try to get lower, or perhaps just gravity pulls them down and they tend to slump in that side. I want to think of a cue that brings a how element in. And so the example here is begin to lengthen your lower right rib cage away from your right hip crease, as if you're being pulled toward the top of the wall by a hook, right? So I'm giving them a how do you do that? And so this is, again, not an element that is about the what, which is triangle pose, the shape, but is how. How do we go about this? Bringing a quality of lift is one answer to how we go about this amongst the 12,748 ways that could be how we would do something in triangle pose. Then we want to think of an integrity element. So example in triangle pose is continue to breathe steadily. And I would pause for them to take 3 breaths. Keep the lift of your right side body strong. Now notice I actually did 2 integrity elements there. One temptation, once someone's lengthening their body and doing all these things in triangle pose, is to their breath to get a little bit panty, or perhaps their breath to freeze up. So I'm giving a breath integrity cue, which is really a simple one. Continue to breathe steadily. And then I'm also giving an integrity cue of the temptation to collapse the bend of the back, to collapse the spine. We really want a straight spine, a lengthened, long, mostly straight spine in triangle pose. And so the temptation is to collapse on one side. And so there's an integrity cue there of keep the lift of your right side body strong. As an example of a nuance cue, as you twist toward the ceiling, is there a vertebra, a spot in your spine that isn't twisting as much as it could be? That's really common, that when we do something like a twist, and triangle has a twist in it, where the twist is done in this habitual way, and oftentimes we have little places we don't take advantage of and move where we can move. You might notice this yourself if you just go into a twist and then just kind of go into it habitually, and then just notice, oh, are there spots where actually I'm not turning as much as I can? And usually there are. And that will be the case for your students as well. So that's bringing nuance, right? It's what's something that they might otherwise miss in the pose. And then the cue for essence. This is a standing pose. You know how to stand well. I probably wouldn't say it with that tonality, but you get the idea there, which is, right, they know it's a standing pose. They know how to stand. So stand and stand well. And yes, that will change the pose for people. As obvious as it sounds, it will change the pose for people because it's inviting something more intuitive to come online, something that they have a life experience of doing. And most people, surprisingly, they know the difference between standing and standing well, and it'll change how they're doing the pose because they probably didn't think of triangle pose before as just standing, right? Sometimes they get in their head about, oh, my foot's got to be here, and my knee's got to be here, and I got to be doing this with my arm and all that. And they forget kind of that bigger picture, that bigger sense of the holism of this is just standing with a weird bend in the body, really. And so it can help them reground in just the basic element of what the pose is about physically. So that is how you can start to brainstorm some various elements of shine, is just pick for a pose, just go through. Or can I name five things, one from each category, that would be a shine example. And this will help you not only come up with more examples of how you add shine when you do your cues, but also how you can be careful not to get stuck in one neighborhood and actually explore the full range of possibilities of what you can queue. So enjoy.